last 2 days. It's been absolutely wonderful. I have never been to Guayaquil before, and I'm really enjoying myself. And the strength of the intellectual energy has been absolutely fabulous. So, I want to start today with a story, which won't surprise anyone who heard me speak yesterday. This story starts actually with a young man. And there's an old man in it too, but I'm not going to tell you about him until the very end. He was a fascinating man, and everyone thought that he saw the future. But when I was a young man, around the age of 23, 24, like most people, I was very excited about the future. And one of my first jobs, I worked for a famous American Wall Street information company called Moody's Investors Service. Moody's Investors Service is well known for publishing financial information about companies and governments and how their credit worthiness and whether it makes sense to invest in them. So I got a job as a salesperson at Moody's. And when I got there, Moody's had, for decades and decades, 80 or 90 years, had successfully sold big, thick books. The kind of books that you can't carry around. They're too heavy. And people would reference these books when they were trying to learn about a different company or a government and so on. My job was to sell the books. So my boss, he gave me a list and phone numbers and said, go sell. Well, Moody's at the same time that I got there was struggling to make the transition from an analog or a book publisher to a digital publisher of information. And I learned very quickly that the customers, this is about 1990, so the customers who were banks and governments, sometimes public libraries, they actually wanted the digital information. It was better for them, the information that they could use in their computer. So that's what I sold. And I would go to my boss and say, hey, we should do more of this. And the other, typically older people, frankly, that I worked with, they didn't understand it and they didn't try to. They wanted to continue doing what they were doing. That was frustrating to me. So when I got frustrated, I looked at a picture that I had put on my wall. This was the picture. And I said to myself, I don't want to be the ostrich with its head stuck in the sand. Instead, I want to go towards the future. And I want to try to learn more about how people will use this information. And it seemed obvious to me then that the computer that I had on my desk, I'd never had a computer at work before, and my customers, that eventually those computers should be able to be linked. That's how I was thinking about it. Why isn't this one linked to that one? Seemed obvious to me, right? And then maybe we could share information. So, well, today we're here to talk about the Internet of Things. And it's important, I think, to begin to discuss where the Internet of Things is going and how it will impact us to start at the beginning. But first we're going to talk about some definitions and the perceptions we have of what Internet of Things actually means. It's a very, very broad topic. While most people hear about Internet of Things, an image in their mind looks like this. A sci-fi picture, right? It's a robot. Not very attractive. He would look better with his head in the sand, I think. But in truth, we're seeing more and more people who look like this. Now, we're not seeing too many people walk around with Google Glass or whatever today, but when the piece on the right shrinks and it's just here, you're going to start seeing people do this. And when we talk about big data and how to integrate from our day-to-day experience into data capture and computers, it's devices like this that make a difference. What most people have today who have a device is something that we call a wearable. Something like that. This is an Apple Watch, right? Does anybody in the room have an upband or a jawbone or, yeah, right? A handful of people. I've had several of them, and usually they break. And I stopped buying them for a little while, but I'll buy another one at some point before long, because they're going to get better and better and better. But that device is really a highly useful computer on your wrist that's connected to multiple other devices if you tell it or allow it to be connected. Pretty soon, the car that you buy, if you don't own one already, is going to be connected. And this isn't just about like self-driving cars and things like that we hear about. This is about the car we're driving down the street connected via GPS or other things. So over the past several years, we've seen an explosion of wearable devices. This is all very, very real data. Let's pause for a minute here and define a little bit what the Internet of Things really means. First of all, it's a network of interconnected objects that are able to collect and exchange data using sensors. And I'll talk about sensors in a second. Second, any device in the broader network, an IoT device or connected device that can be monitored or controlled from a remote location, okay? So this is very, very straightforward. The overall ecosystem of the Internet of Things includes all the components that allow a business, a government, or any other organization or a consumer to connect these devices using remote controls. This is a connected device, right? If you really think about it, dashboards, networks, analytics, storage, and security. And we haven't talked, I'm not going to cover today the massive growth in storage requirements and actual use, but all of these things mirror each other. So what's a sensor? And sensors are a key building block or component of the IoT ecosystem. But a sensor is any device that detects or measures a physical property, records that data, and helps it get stored for future use or interpretation. So for example, is that an Apple Watch that you're wearing? Okay, so that watch, however you have it set, it may record your body temperature. It records how many steps you take in a day. It may record your heart rate. If you set it in a certain way, it can tell you what the quality of your sleep is, so on and so forth. That information over time can allow us to modify our behavior in a way that has results that we define or we want. So, I started with a little history. We're going to go back even further. Again, I think it's important, if we want to think about where we're going, to understand where we came from. And in the 1960s, we really saw the ARPANET, which was the original, and I apologize if some of you really know this already, but context, I think, is very important here. The ARPANET started in the 1960s, mostly as a way to connect some government computers and some academic computers. Pretty straightforward. Just a year or two, a couple years later, several other academic computers said, this is pretty interesting. These computers ought to be connected. In 1973, very, very quickly after the ARPANET started to get more and more academic usage, by then there were 13 to 20, somewhere between 15 and 20 real nodes in North America, and we were beginning to see the network connect to Europe. By 1990 or 1982, that network was robust, but still really only connected academic institutions and government computers. And I realize people can't really read the names on the board here or on the slide, but you'll see names like Berkeley, Stanford, Cornell, Brown, Dartmouth College, and others. Well, not quite 10 years later, we were right at the dawn of the commercialization of really of the internet. It hadn't really started to get commercialized yet, but it was beginning to happen. And when I was sitting at my desk, just a little bit before this, I'm sure I was reading articles about these things happening. You know, I was not even really a technologist. It just seemed obvious that this was about to cross over into the business sphere, and in fact, it did. So in the mid-90s, you started to really see the commercialization of the internet. And so when you build anything, you have to have infrastructure, right? The infrastructure was really built by the major telecom companies. At that time, UUNet, which doesn't exist anymore, AT&T, and so on and so forth. And my first startup company was in 1995. And, you know, we took a huge risk. It was an incredible experience. But I remember being in Manhattan in an office building on a snowy day in the middle of February. I want to say it was February of 1996 at this point. It was a Wednesday, and we were in the midst of a blizzard. So there was 20 inches of snow on the ground. Normally, people would be at work. The streets were empty, except for one person cross-country skiing down the middle of Canal Street, which, if anyone knows Manhattan, is in Lower Manhattan. And I remember saying to myself, will people actually really use the internet? I was all alone at work, and I felt all alone in the business world, to be honest, just like the scene that I saw on the street. Well, lo and behold, 20 years later, it's everywhere, right? Everywhere, every corner of the world, and it's radically changed our society. But it's not just the network that's extended and made this happen. It's really all the building blocks that consumers care about that's caused this rapid proliferation. 1997, we saw AOL Instant Messenger. I think it was 1994, the first real browser, which came from work that Mark Andreessen did at University of Illinois, that became the Netscape's Mosaic browser. 1998, 2 years after I had that thought during the blizzard, World Wide Web usage in the US passed 1 million. Still a tiny number. 1998 also saw Google and PayPal launch. And for me, these were two critical building blocks because Google did a better job mapping information than anyone else via their search algorithm. And PayPal made it easy for us to exchange money. And it actually raised confidence that, for the most part, credit card transactions were secure, mostly secure. In 2003, Apple launched iTunes. 2005, so less than 10 years later, we went from a million users to 1 billion users. Today, there's almost 4 billion users. And I want to say, where does Ecuador stand? I did this research like yesterday. I don't know how current this is, but I think it's pretty current. Ecuador is about 53rd in the world in terms of population penetration of the internet, about 43% of the population. Now, Ecuador, and forgive me if there are any economists in the room, but from a GDP point of view, Ecuador is in the 60s, I think, in terms of world rank. So internet penetration is significantly better than economic size, but it still needs to improve, obviously, right? So this graph here is percentage adoption of the IPv6 protocol, which the reason why I put it up is because between 2014 and 2016, in just 2 years, you see tremendous growth in IPv6 adoption. And it's important because that kind of adoption allows for simultaneous users to a network, amongst other things. And so that sort of advance in technology is part of the infrastructure that makes it easier for us to all be on the network at the same time, or for multiple devices to all be on the network at the same time. So, we're going to talk about the Internet of Things, right? Here we are in 2017. We've got an infrastructure built. We've got the World Wide Web is available to the vast majority of the population in the world. We've got many, many devices that are connected to each other over the World Wide Web. We've got increased bandwidth and throughput so that your experience in general is pretty good, and it's improving every day. And lastly, you have sensors. And sensors, we don't see them, but things like sensors or beacons are a necessary, in fact, a precondition for the Internet of Things. And so when you are buying something now, almost always there's going to be a sensor. This room probably has a sensor that's connected to the air conditioning system, for example. One big thing that has to improve, and it's also a dependency, is what we call interoperability. So that the more one device is looking to communicate with another device, they have to be able to communicate effectively on the same operating system. So that is one thing that massive improvements still need to happen in. So let's talk about some real industry sectors that are being impacted here And they're in ways where you can all see it if you start to really pay attention, if you haven't already. In manufacturing, and this data primarily applies to North America. 35% of companies in the manufacturing sector use sensors now. Another 10% plan to do so within a year, and another 8% within 3 years. So fully half of U.S. manufacturers are using sensors both in their process and in computer or interconnected type devices. In transportation, in a mere 3 years, we'll have 220 million connected cars. This is happening now. In oil, gas, and mining, 5.4 million devices will be in use by the year 2020. And they provide very important environmental and efficiency metrics. But interestingly, your average rig in the Pacific or the Atlantic or the North Sea may have 30,000 sensors being deployed on that hardware, testing all kinds of different things. They're only really using 1% of the information they're collecting today, which is, I think, fascinating. So, by now it should be clear that this is a part of our lives and will be increasingly so. This year, we will exceed 8 billion connected devices between consumer and this is, again, just in North America right now, okay? Between consumer and business-connected devices, 8 billion. On the consumer side, it's growing. On the business side, it's growing even more rapidly. And by 2020, they're projecting 20 billion. The direct impact on the consumer, and by the way, I should say, because I don't think I put it in this slide, by 2020, businesses will have invested $6 trillion in Internet of Things type connected technology. And by 2025, analysts are saying they should expect to receive a return in 5 years of double that investment. So, businesses, for the most part, are not, even though we talk a lot here about social entrepreneurship, for the most part, businesses are not altruistic. But they see that there's great opportunity here. And that opportunity crosses multiple thresholds and in many ways will make for a better consumer experience. So in 2015, over 3 million ATMs were outfitted with smart devices and cameras. So if you've ever been to an ATM where you put your card in and very quickly a teller, you had a problem, sometimes a teller will right away say, hey, can I help you? That's because there's a sensor in that ATM. Beacons are being deployed and connected to mobile in a way that helps retailers make for a better consumer shopping experience. In the healthcare sector alone, which I think is particularly fascinating, nearly 700 million devices will be used by 2020, collecting data, automating different processes, so on and so forth. And by 2030, the majority, so literally 12 or 13 years from now, the majority of home appliances will be connected to the internet. And on your way home, you'll be able to change the temperature. You'll automatically have, certain goods that you run out of be sent with your permission, and so on. Opportunities for consumer product companies are obvious, and they're studying these quite a bit today. improved logistics and fulfillment, automated product reorders, longer-term loyalty for certain providers that use machine learning and technology well. So I was talking with this gentleman in the front row about Amazon and the Amazon Echo earlier today. And if you are an Amazon customer and you have an Echo in your house, it's easy to tell the Echo, hey, we need more dog food. And the truth is, dog food is, comes in a 30 or 40-pound bag, right? You don't necessarily want to drive to the store and get it if it can show up on your doorstep in 2 or 3 days. That's a pretty good use of that technology. And there are hundreds and hundreds of other examples. That kind of convenience, especially if it's coupled with a lower price, makes for a pretty good customer experience. Lots of more personalization. And then lastly, the most sophisticated retailers will really marry strong branding with better data. And this, in turn, creates much more loyalty and building strong, and the ability to build stronger relationships over time. So, you might ask, what are the risks? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about risk. One risk is very obvious, which is security risk, right? Will my personal information be protected? Will I grant information to a provider like Google or someone else to use my information? And most governments and the companies are partnering to build better consumer protections in there, but I think it's something that we need to all be vigilant about. Also, there are really bad people out there, as we know, that want to steal your personal information, and you have to be highly vigilant. The truth is that if it's my information, the responsibility has to start with me. Just like making smart choices about where we travel or putting ourselves in risky situations and so on, has to start there. There's another set of risk, though, that I'm as or more concerned about. And it's what I would call the non-obvious or unintended consequences of this sort of technology. For example, creativity. If our computers are interpreting everything and they're doing it in relatively the same way, will we tend to be less creative about how we might solve a problem? I don't know, but I think we should ask the question. As human beings, we are intuitive creatures, right? It's really a huge part of what makes us different. The ability to love, the ability to express and feel emotion, sadness, whatever. The ability to make decisions based on instinct or intuition. Will this become dampened because of technology? I don't know, but I want to ask the question, and I think we all should. So let's shift gears for the last part of my talk here and talk about healthcare, because I think healthcare is potentially the biggest opportunity that all outside of convenience and so on, that all of us can take advantage of in the relatively near term and do so in a way that improves quality of life for ourselves and people we care about. Today, 25% of Americans own a wearable device. Now, whether they use it or not, the data says 25% of them own one. Health and fitness apps are growing at 5, 10, 15% a year. attitudes are beginning to change. So 60% of users today are willing to share information with Google. Now, most of these are younger people, to be honest, but 60% crosses every age demographic. And the same type of positive attitude relative to this issue, we're seeing this with Apple, Microsoft, and other online companies. The promise exists for dramatic intervention and earlier treatment for chronic disease. So it's not just high blood pressure, for example, that leads to, or that's a leading indicator of heart disease. You can begin to go deeper, like blood glucose levels and other stress factors and other real important aspects of science that you can begin to analyze, measure, and take action against. This can lead to positive behavior modification. We've coined a term over the last few years that we call the quantified self. There's a famous phrase, which is, we can't improve what we don't measure. So if you want to lose weight, run faster, get stronger, lots of other things, get smarter, remember more, get taller, that's not going to happen for me, but if you measure it and you begin to say, here's how I want to improve it, then you can begin to take action that can help you make improvement against it. So now I want to share a quick case study that I think will illustrate this. And this is true. And by the way, I found this yesterday. It was easy to find. Get the tech help. I want to just toggle over to that and then go back.
Okay, so what? Yeah, okay, let's. Where was the? It's a video, right? It's a video.
That's it.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you want to put in
Yeah, we can do it.
here? Okay.
So the man I'm going to show you he's a doctor. And I think everybody should be able to read this. He's from the American Midwest. I don't know how much you know about the American Midwest, but one of the stereotypes is that people don't necessarily eat terribly healthy, and many people are overweight. So on your far left, in 1989, age of 41, thin, healthy-looking male, right? 10 years later, I don't know how far overweight he is there, but it's a lot. He took action, and 10 years after that, he looked like a different person, right? And it probably saved his life. How did he do it? He started to use various devices and coupled with real science to change his own behavior. This wasn't rocket science. It wasn't about taking a bunch of medicine. It was about measuring, changing behavior, and then gradually seeing the improvements. And you'll have access to these slides, so you can go look at this if you'd like to afterwards. He used a variety of personal scanners and sensors to quantify what was happening in his body and then to make changes. And none of these are terribly expensive. All of them are readily available today. And in fact, this is at least 7 or 8 years ago when he started this process, I think even longer. But MyFitnessPal, a Fitbit, a Wi-Fi weight scale, so he would step on the scale and a spreadsheet in his computer would automatically capture both his body mass index and his actual weight. And a sleep and a heart rate monitor. So you can see some of the results here. His resting heart rate over this period of time went from 70 to 40 as a 61-year-old man. His sleep, the quality of his sleep, improved dramatically. So the average infant has about 50% REM sleep. He went from before, or I think actually for most adults, it's about 20% REM sleep. He went to between 45 and 65%. And we all know how good it feels and how effective or productive we are and how good our mood is after a great night's sleep, right? He changed the quality of his sleep in a way that totally impacted his life. So, I hope that was informative. I literally found that yesterday on SlideShare, and I'll share it with everyone. There are many, many other examples of this sort of thing because people are starting to do this now for themselves. So, here's what I don't want you to do, is be like the people who are ostriches and stick your heads in the sand. The truth is that what's happening is inevitable. It's up to us to control it, to use it to our benefit, to protect ourselves and each other from its risks, but ultimately to use these tools, which are readily available, to make our lives and others better. Now, I started today telling you I would talk about an old man who everyone thought could see the future. So around the time that I was at Moody's Investor Service, one day I read an obituary in the New York Times. And I knew this man's name from reading about him in the newspaper and the business press. He was a very famous and very wealthy businessman. He started a company in the 1960s that grew to publish very successful magazines like Computer World and other technology-oriented magazines. So to start Computer World in the 1960s or 1970s was really pretty early, right? He went on to start 30 or 40 different magazines, and he became a very wealthy and frankly generous person. And by the time he died, he was wealthy and had built a large company. So in this obituary, there was an interview that was included from a reporter who asked the question, "Sir, you've done this and this and this. How do you know what's going to happen in the future? And he looked at the reporter and he said, I can't predict the future. No one can. I just see today for what it is. So my message is that many of the things around us are happening now. All of those clues are there. And especially for the younger people in the room, you are closer to the information of what's really happening. You understand it better than older people do. But it's incumbent upon all of you to shape what's going to happen, and frankly, to take care of us as we get old. So anyhow, muchas gracias. I'm happy to take questions.